All right, here we go. Attorney Tom Mesereau, welcome back to VladTV.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
It was an honor when you sat down with us last time and, went into the various cases. Of course, the Michael Jackson case, the Suge Knight case, the Mike Tyson case. But the reason why you're here is because of your involvement in the Bill Cosby case. And just recently, Bill Cosby was freed after 3 years.
He's free. He cannot be retried. He cannot be re-prosecuted on these grounds. And that was a great announcement. I'm very, very happy for he and his family.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were very happy. I think overall, there's just a lot of celebration for Bill Cosby, which, you don't know was going to happen initially, but it seems like a lot of people are happy.
Well, the justice system finally prevailed. Unfortunately, he was put through 2 trials, some appeals, almost 3 years in prison, all of which should not have happened.
Yeah.
But eventually, the justice system saw the light and did the right thing. But he should not have been put through what he was put through, ever.
Right. So the reason why you're here today is because when it comes to this trial and it comes to our viewers, people hear tidbits, people hear this, people hear that. But I actually want to go through the entire case with you from the beginning to what ultimately happened. And as someone that worked on this case, I think you're very familiar with it.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and start in the very beginning. So in 2005, Andrea Constant, who was a staff member at Temple University, said that she had been drugged and molested at his home a year earlier, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So she ended up filing both criminal and civil charges against him?
Yes. She went to the prosecution, made a police report, and she also filed a civil suit at one point.
Okay. Is it typical for people to file both criminal and civil at the same time? Because I thought that usually you file the criminal first, and if you win that, you automatically win the civil.
There's no particular way to do it. You can do either one before the other if you want to. People make police reports all the time that don't result in civil cases. People file civil cases that don't result in police reports, and some people do both.
Okay. So she went ahead and filed this case, and 13 other women, 12 of whom remain anonymous, agreed to be witnesses who claimed to be familiar with similar accounts of sexual assault by Bill Cosby.
I won't comment on that. I'm not going to comment on any accusers, including Miss Constant.
Okay.
I will comment on Bill Cosby, who I know.
Got it. Well, I'm just laying out the whole case, and you don't have to comment on it, but I just want everyone to know the extent of everything that happens. Okay. So in that case, he ended up doing a deposition.
In the civil case?
In the civil case.
Yes.
Got it. Now, that document originally was supposed to be sealed, and at one point, it got unsealed.
It was originally sealed by a federal judge, and at some point, the media made a request, and the federal judge decided to unseal it. That's correct.
Okay. Is that a typical thing to do?
Well, you say is it typical. I mean, no high-profile case involving a high-profile celebrity ever seems to be typical. Because forces and personalities and people seem to get involved in high-profile cases that you don't normally see in other cases. It's not unusual to seal a deposition. It's not unusual to seal evidence. There are privacy concerns. There are other concerns, governmental concerns about how it will be misused. And it was sealed by a federal judge, and then it was unsealed.
Okay. So that particular deposition was unsealed, and it was released publicly. I went ahead and read through it, and there was sort of some interesting stuff in that case. So in that case, he testified under oath that he had given a sedative to at least one other woman who appeared to be Miss Serignice and other people. And during the actual deposition, and I read both sides, the lawyer for Miss Constant said, when you got the Quaaludes, was it in your mind that you were going to use these Quaaludes for young women that you wanted to have sex with? Mr. Cosby said yes. But he also said that this was consensual for everyone that was involved. Okay, so when they asked if the women had known they were taking Quaaludes, Mr. Cosby's lawyer abruptly cut the questioning off, and Mr. Cosby suggested in his answers that the pill taking and the sex had been consensual. He said that he met the woman whose name was redacted in Las Vegas. She meets me backstage. I gave her Quaaludes. We then have sex. So the name of the woman was originally redacted, but based on court records and so forth, they're saying there was a woman named Miss Serignice. She said she couldn't comment because there's pending litigation, but she said there was nothing about the episode that was consensual. She only took the pills because Mr. Cosby was an authority figure and she felt frightened and compelled. So ultimately, the prosecutors declined to press charges, citing lack of evidence. But then Ms. Constant filed a civil case against the comedian. So this is where it kind of gets interesting. So at that point, the prosecutor was Bruce L. Castor Jr., right?
Yes.
And he said that he declined to actually charge Mr. Cosby over the matter. But Mr. Cosby actually sat for depositions in a separate lawsuit filed against him by Ms. Constant, which he ended up paying her $3.38 million in 2006. So there was an interview with Mr. Castor, the old prosecutor, about this. So who also is kind of funny enough, he was actually one of the defense lawyers for Donald Trump's second impeachment trial.
That's true.
Right. So they basically made a deal with each other. He made a deal that said that he would not prosecute because Bill Cosby would basically invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, so he wouldn't have to testify in the upcoming civil case. And he did this in order to help the civil case.
Well, you'd have to look at Mr. Castor's comments. He's testified under oath that he assembled his team. His team included prosecutors from his office.
Mm-hmm.
It included 2 police departments, Cheltenham and Montgomery County. It included staffers, and they did an exhaustive investigation into the allegations. And he concluded that this case did not belong in a criminal courtroom. And he also concluded that, in his mind, the best form of justice would be to resolve this in a civil proceeding, not a criminal case. And what he says he did was make an agreement not to prosecute Mr. Cosby. The agreement was made by him and his office. There's been some discussion in this case as to whether Mr. Castor could bind the whole office. The reality is it was the office speaking, not just Mr. Castor. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has basically said the office made an agreement. He made an agreement that this case did not belong in a criminal courtroom, would not be in a criminal courtroom, and for that reason, Mr. Cosby had no right to assert his right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, and that Mr. Cosby, in reliance on that agreement not to prosecute, had to give a deposition. And that's exactly what happened.
So Bill Cosby agreed to do a deposition where he admitted to consensually giving quaaludes to other women in the past. Not Miss Constant, but to other women in the past.
Mr.
Right?
Cosby has always maintained that any relationship or affair he ever had was consensual.
Right.
He has always maintained he never did anything illegal. He never violated any sexual assault statute or rape statute or anything like that, that everything was consensual, lawful, and proper. He has always maintained that. And I want to say something else about that.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Cosby is about to turn 84 years old. He's legally blind. He was sentenced to 3 to 10 years. Given his age, given his physical infirmities, he could have easily gotten out by now on parole. If he had expressed remorse, taken some courses they gave at the prison, and played ball with the authorities, he would have been released on parole. Even at his age, even being legally blind, he refused to express remorse for something he said he never did. He refused to admit committing some crime that he says he never ever did. He refused to take the courses in the prison, and he refused to make it easy for himself to get out on parole. He was a man of absolute conviction that he'd never committed a crime and never engaged in non-consensual sex. He's been adamant about that from the time I met him. He was adamant about that throughout the trial. He was adamant about that when he was in prison and could have gotten out if he played ball with the authorities. He refused to do that. He's a man of conviction and a man of character, and he stood his ground no matter what the consequences. He made a statement that it doesn't matter how old I am, doesn't matter that I'm legally blind. I'll do the 10 years if I have to before I'll admit to something I didn't do.
Right, and we'll get into that whole part, a little bit later. So essentially, the district attorney Bruce Castor, made a public announcement saying that he's not going to be prosecuting criminally.
Mr. Castor, when he was the district attorney, issued a press release announcing that he was not going to prosecute Mr. Cosby.
Right. And what kind of became a little bit fuzzy in terms of that part was whether a press release is the same thing as a contract or a binding letter from a district attorney. You know what I'm talking about?
If a district attorney says, I'm not going to prosecute you, I agree with you, I'm not going to prosecute you, you now don't have a Fifth Amendment right in a civil deposition. That is a binding contract according to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now remember, he testified to making this agreement under oath. They found some internal memoranda in the district attorney's office that confirmed this was in fact a binding agreement. He issued a press release announcing Mr. Cosby would not be prosecuted. You put all that together, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said this was a binding agreement not to prosecute. He bound the district attorney's office. It was not just dependent on an individual personality like his. And he said Cosby relied on this agreement to his detriment. He gave up constitutional rights because of this agreement. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, given this set of circumstances, he should never have been prosecuted. There was an agreement not to prosecute him. He never should have been put through 2 trials, never should have been put through appeals, never should have gone to prison. And they released him and said he can no longer be prosecuted for anything related to this case.
Okay, so this happened back in 2005. No criminal charges were filed. Bill Cosby paid $3.4 million to Miss Constant, and life went on.
Listen, I represented Michael Jackson. He settled cases. I represented other celebrities. They settled cases.
Yeah.
Business advisors, business lawyers will often tell a celebrity, settle a case. You have bigger fish to fry. You have a career in front of you. There are all sorts of projects that will net you a lot more income than what you're paying to settle. And this is not unusual for a celebrity to get rid of a civil case so they can do better things and bigger things with their career.
I've settled cases that I was completely innocent of. But once again, the lawyer said, listen, just pay this amount. It'll be less than going to trial with it. And even if you win, the person who's suing you, can't pay the money if you try to countersue. So just pay the money and keep it moving.
It's a business decision.
It's a business decision.
And people like Mr. Cosby, Michael Jackson, they have business advisors who will tell them, this is nothing. Get rid of this and move on to bigger and better things. You're talented. You're popular. You can do great things with your career. Don't let this sidetrack you. Get rid of it.
Okay, so this happens in 2005. The case gets settled civilly. Bill pays his money to Miss Constant, and that's supposed to be the end of it. So then in 2014, the comedian Hannibal Buress did a joke about Bill Cosby and the alleged rapes and so forth. Someone in the audience recorded the video, posted on social media, and it started to go viral. And that sort of created sort of an air about this type of thing, I feel. But once again, nothing was happening until 2016. So then in 2016, the new district attorney, I guess when he was running, part of his ads was he was announcing that he would prosecute Bill Cosby.
He had ads on TV that if I'm elected, I'm going to prosecute Mr. Cosby.
For District Attorney in Montgomery County, Kevin Steele, First Assistant DA with a 98% conviction rate and tough sentences for sexual predators. Or Bruce Castor, a former DA who refused to prosecute Bill Cosby. Castor said, we don't charge people for making a mistake or doing something foolish. Many more victims came forward, and Castor admitted he could have used their testimony against Cosby. But Castor didn't even try. Bruce Castor was not looking out for the victims.
And he ended up winning a close election. Mm-hmm. But he interjected politics into the legal process, which was, in my opinion, a complete disaster. Disaster for everybody, especially the legal system, because the legal system was misused for political purposes at every step of this case.
Okay, he wins the election. He is now the district attorney. And he makes good on his promise and starts to actually prosecute Bill Cosby. Now, from what I understand, right around that time, Bill Cosby's defense team was trying to get the criminal charges thrown out and they took the kind of unusual step of actually calling the former DA, Mr. Castor, as a witness at pretrial hearing.
Well, the defense of Bill Cosby before both trials tried to get these charges dismissed on the basis that Mr. Castor had bound the office in a non-prosecution agreement, that Mr. Cosby had relied on that non-prosecution agreement, and that it would be illegal to bring this case in a criminal courtroom. And both times the trial judge denied the defense motion to dismiss.
Okay. So then the first trial starts. You are not part of this trial.
The first trial, no.
Okay. So, and once again, Mr. Castor said that he decided not to prosecute Mr. Cosby because that would set off a chain of events that would get Andre Constant some justice. That is why he made that deal not to prosecute, but allow basically Bill Cosby to make certain statements that he felt would help her in her civil trial. To me, what I find a little bit strange is why would a district attorney care about a civil trial?
He's made numerous statements to the effect that he believed that this case did not belong in a criminal courtroom, that these grievances should be resolved in a civil context. That was his thought process. And he has stated that he thought he was helping everybody by shifting it away from a criminal courtroom into a civil context. And that was his choice. He chose as district attorney to agree not to prosecute. And he basically did more than agree not to prosecute. He instructed Mr. Cosby and his lawyers that they had no right to assert their Fifth Amendment privilege because he had waived any right to prosecute him. So it was a two-sided arrangement.
Yeah.
The DA agrees not to prosecute. Because of that, you have no constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment to not make statements. You now must make statements in reliance on my agreement not to prosecute. That's basically what happened. But there's something else you need to know. You need to know about the ugly insertion of politics into this whole equation. Bruce Castor ran for district attorney. It's an elected position. His opponent was the person who became the trial judge in the Cosby case.
Yeah.
And apparently I wasn't involved and I didn't know any of these people. It was a bitterly fought election. Castor won, his opponent lost, and the opponent subsequently became a trial judge. He became the trial judge in the Bill Cosby case. So when the defense asked to have the charges thrown out on the basis that Mr. Castor had made a binding agreement, and a hearing was conducted, and Mr. Castor testified under oath that he had made a binding agreement, that he had bound the office, his old political opponent in a bitter election, who was now the trial judge, made a ruling that he lacked credibility.
Wow. Okay.
You have to keep all this in mind because ugly, dirty politics was involved in this case, in my opinion, from day one. This was a clear case of ugly, dirty politics inserting itself into the legal process and, in my opinion, corrupting the legal process.
Okay. So then we go forward to 2017. And in terms of the backdrop of what's happening, the Me Too movement starts to go viral on social media. Although Me Too had been out there since about 2006, that year was when it really started to go viral, and you started to see a lot of men getting accused and so forth. And Bill Cosby was, one of the main people in that whole Me Too environment. So after the judge essentially threw out the agreement that Mr. Castor had, the trial started to begin. Now, the question is the statute of limitations. Hadn't that been completely, invoked at that point?
The district attorney who filed the case against Mr. Cosby thought he had filed the case within the statutory required period of time. That's called the statute of limitations. If a case is not filed within the statute of limitations, it's too late.
Right.
He thought he had filed it within a few days of the statute running. The word we use is running in the legal profession. We did our investigation, looked into various statements, testimony, phone records of all kinds, and concluded that this had been filed too late. And the defense, at least my team in the second trial, the first team in the initial trial didn't raise the issue. But we raised the issue of a statute of limitations after we investigated this issue. And we basically made a statement to the court that this was filed too late. The court does not have the power to hear this case. The word is jurisdiction in the law. Jurisdiction means you have the power to hear something. We said the court lacked jurisdiction. It didn't have the power to hear this case because it was filed too late. We said to the court, we have the evidence to show it. We want to have a hearing before any trial starts, and the judge would not let us have such a hearing.
Okay, because you feel it's politically motivated.
I think the judge just didn't want to see what the evidence was.
Right.
What he said was, I'll let the jury decide after we have a trial, which is not the way it's supposed to be. If you lack jurisdiction, if you lack power, you're not supposed to have a trial that you don't have the power to have. And judges are supposed to be neutral referees. Judges are supposed to not favor one side or the other. They're supposed to follow the law, follow procedure, and make judgments based upon what's fair to both sides, not just one side, both sides. In my opinion, this judge was out for a conviction, wanted his show trial from day one, and was not going to listen to anything that suggested your show trial is not going to happen. That's my belief. It's just my opinion.
Okay, so 2017, the first trial goes underway. And by using this old unsealed deposition, they felt that they had enough evidence for a criminal conviction. So what I think a lot of people don't realize is that, from the outside looking in, it looks like Bill Cosby's on trial and like 50 women are accusing him. But in fact, it's only that same woman from 2005, Miss Constant.
She is the accuser in the criminal case, yes.
Right.
Now, in the first trial, which I wasn't part of, the judge allowed one unrelated accuser to testify. In the second trial, which I was lead counsel in, the judge increased the number of unrelated accusers from 1 to 5. Again, in my opinion, he wanted this show trial and he wanted a conviction. Why else would you increase the number of unrelated accusers from 1 to 5 if you really were trying to be a neutral judge, not show favoritism to either side, and be measured and fair to both sides? That's not what happened in this case.
Right. And that's just very important, I think, that Bill Cosby's criminal case was only based on an accusation from Miss Constant from 2005.
That's
It had nothing to do with these 50 or 60 women that people claim that he also did something with. It was really just one woman from a 2005 case that she already got paid over $3 million for.
There was one principal accuser in the criminal case. That's correct.
Got it. So in June of that year, Miss Constant actually got to take the stand and tell her story for the first time, because up until that point, there was no criminal trial, right? So she took the stand. She said that Mr. Cosby had given her pills that he claimed were herbal and said, to take the edge off. But she said that she was paralyzed after taking the pills. She said, in my head, I was trying to get my hands to move or my legs to move, but I was frozen. She said 20 minutes later, he put his hands on her genitalia. I wasn't able to fight in any way. I wanted to stop, and so forth. And there was one other woman who testified based on an experience she had with Bill.
Again, in the first trial, which I was not part of,
Yeah.
the judge allowed the prosecution to bring one unrelated accuser.
Like a character witness, sort of?
They call
like
it
that.
something else.
They
We
call
call
it
it
something else.
404B witnesses, but it's designed to show pattern, absence of mistake. There are some legal terms that are used to explain why this type of testimony may or may not be appropriate. It's not supposed to be character evidence, but it's supposed to be pattern evidence. It's a whole separate area of the law. There are many people who think you should never bring someone who's unrelated to the central accusation. It should only be based on the central accuser and whatever evidence exists
I agree.
that surrounds that.
I agree.
But again, in the first trial, the judge allowed the accuser to testify and one unrelated accuser to testify. In the second trial, which I was part of, the judge allowed the primary accuser to testify and 5 other unrelated accusers to testify. He increased the number from 1 to 5 between trials.
Okay, and once again, this whole case is over a 13-year-old incident that happened. And during the trial, Bill Cosby did not give any evidence, but he did have one witness, right?
In the first trial,
First
which
trial.
again I wasn't involved in, there
Yeah.
was one witness. Yes, they called a police witness.
Okay, what did the police witness say?
I'd have to go back over the transcript to really tell you exactly what it wasn't. The witness was not on very long. It was like a 20-minute bit of testimony. And again, I was not there for that.
Got it. Okay, so ultimately the trial concludes. The jury goes to deliberate, and they were deadlocked.
Yes.
What does deadlock mean? Does that mean that all of them did not have the same decision?
Well, you need a unanimous jury to either convict or acquit.
Yeah.
If a jury can't agree unanimously to either convict or acquit, eventually a judge will declare a mistrial. He'll say it's a hung jury. That's what we call it.
Okay, so one person saying not guilty or guilty and everyone else is saying the opposite, that's then a mistrial,
That would be a hung jury. Yeah.
a hung jury, which is what this was. Do you know how many people, did they ever say what the
I've
breakdown?
heard various accounts of it. I can't give you a definite statement on that.
Fair enough. But usually, doesn't the judge usually try to pressure the jury to keep deliberating to come to some sort of conclusion?
Judges can do that. In California, we call it an Allen charge. Sometimes judges will say, jury will announce they're hung, they can't agree, and a judge will order them to go back in and try to deliberate some more and see if they can reach an agreement.
Did this happen in this case or no?
The judge kept them deliberating, as I understand it, and recall, again, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
And then eventually they said, we cannot reach an agreement.
Okay. So essentially, this is a mistrial. No one's guilty or innocent at this point, and they have to redo the whole thing.
Well, you don't have to. The district attorney could have said, we're not going to retry the case.
Aha.
He could have said that if he wanted to.
Right, but that wasn't his platform when he was running.
He did run on the basis that if elected, he would go after Bill Cosby.
There you go. So then in 2018, the retrial happened.
Yes.
And you got brought in on that.
I was brought in as lead trial counsel. That's correct.
Okay. Was there a reason why they chose you over other people?
You'd have to ask them. I've
Okay.
been in and I acquitted Michael Jackson. I freed Robert Blake when they said you can't do it. I've won a lot of federal cases, state cases, all kinds of cases, and I guess they liked my record.
There you go. Well, and then by this time, Me Too had actually escalated in terms of public appearance. Harvey Weinstein was charged with a bunch of stuff, Kevin Spacey, and so forth. So now there's really almost like a bloodlust happening in society over people that are accused for this type of thing. You take on the retrial, and it begins on April 9th, 2018.
I took over and I brought in a trial team
Mm-hmm.
with some very fine lawyers. And when I realized that the trial judge was not likely to give us a fair trial, I was, in my mind, was thinking we've got to be prepared for an appeal if things don't go right.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was when the judge would not have a hearing on statute of limitations, would not dismiss this case based on the non-prosecution agreement, when he increased the number of unrelated accusatory witnesses from 1 to 5,
Mm-hmm.
it was very clear to me the judge wanted this high-profile case and wanted a conviction. And what I did was I had 4 lawyers making a constant record for appeal. They were objecting on the record. They were filing legal points and authorities on the record. They were making motions for mistrials on the record. This was the best case for appeal I had ever been part of because of that strategy. And I'm glad I had them involved. I had some really fine lawyers constantly objecting, constantly moving to dismiss the case, constantly moving for a mistrial, constantly filing points and authorities, we call it in the profession. And this was the best record for appeal I've ever had in a criminal case.
Okay, so the retrial goes underway,
Yes.
and the judge allowed 5 women to take the stand, even though they're not connected to the actual case.
They're not connected to the actual case. Some of them were talking about alleged events going back almost 30 years when you can't find forensic evidence, you can't interview witnesses, people have moved locations, people have changed. It was just an outrage. It was clearly designed to prejudice that jury against Mr. Cosby. That was the only purpose I can even imagine for doing that, is to make sure this was not a fair trial and Mr. Cosby was convicted. That's what, in my opinion, this judge wanted from day one.
Okay. And Bill Cosby, of course, does not take the stand.
He did not, which he has a right not to do.
Absolutely. Was the same police witness called on his side this time or no?
No.
No,
No.
because it just didn't
The
really.
prosecution used the deposition,
Uh-huh.
and there was a lot of discussion with the court about what they could use or not use. And we made numerous objections to that deposition being used. You can imagine what the objections were. The primary problem is that this deposition testimony was based on a non-prosecution agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly another DA gets elected and says, I'm not going to do what that prior DA agreed to do. And as the Pennsylvania Supreme Court emphatically said in their opinion, the office made an agreement, not the individual district attorney. He bound the office. The office had to follow that agreement. They called it a bait and switch, which is another way of saying this was a con game.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he was told there was an agreement. He relied on the agreement. Now the next politically driven DA decides, well, I wasn't there entering into the agreement. That's not the way prosecution works.
Right. Because it's the same department. It's the same DA.
Same office.
Same office, right.
Yes.
Exactly. So the trial is underway. 5 witnesses gets called for the prosecution. No witnesses for the defense. How long did the trial last?
It lasted about 2.5 weeks, as I recall.
Okay. How was Bill Cosby during this process?
Well, this was a horrible experience for Bill Cosby. I mean, who wants to go through something like this?
Twice.
Twice. He's a man in his 80s. You know, you're looking at prison. You're looking at false accusations that you know are not true. And you're looking at a movement surrounding the courthouse with protesters, supporting Me Too, supporting the prosecution. You look at the way politics have inserted themselves into your life and into your legal rights. I mean, anyone would be horribly upset, but he always conducted himself with dignity, always conducted himself with poise and character, and he always believed in himself, and he was a man of real sturdy character. That I have to say that.
But I can imagine he was pretty stressed out.
Well, anybody would be. He didn't show it.
He didn't show it at all.
Mr. Cosby was a very, very strong, determined, principled person throughout my experience with him in this case.
So the trial finally ends. The jury took 2 days to deliberate, and they came back with a.
By the way, we
guilty.
called a witness in that case.
Oh, you did call a witness?
We did.
Who did you call?
We called a woman from Temple University. You can read her testimony. It's very important.
Okay, can you say what it was?
I don't want to describe. I want to paraphrase what she said, but you can read her.
But it was for Bill Cosby's behalf.
And we called some other witnesses too.
Aha. Who are the other witnesses?
Check the record.
Check the record.
What they said.
Okay. Well, the jury deliberates for 2 days, and they come back with a guilty verdict. When you heard that guilty verdict, what did you think?
I was very upset because I knew the trial had been unfair. I knew this judge had not been a neutral arbiter like a judge is supposed to be. I knew he had let prejudicial testimony in that never should have entered that courtroom. I knew the deposition didn't belong in that trial. And I knew Mr. Cosby had been denied his rights repeatedly throughout the trial I was in. As I said before, he wouldn't allow a hearing on statute of limitations to see if he even had the power to conduct the trial. He upped the number of unrelated accusers from 1 to 5. He made statements and, in my opinion, facial expressions throughout the trial that were, my opinion, were inappropriate. We made a very strong record about how he was conducting himself. But knowing that Mr. Cosby had to face prison, had to face appeals, I felt terrible for him. I really did.
Right. Because, for example, this was a recent case, completely unrelated, because you mentioned facial expressions and everything else like that. There was a guy named Arab who was a regular guest on our show. He recently got sentenced to 45 years in prison. And during the sentencing, the judge made a comment about how, you're basically rolling your eyes, your hands are crossed, you're acting disrespectfully as I'm reading this. It doesn't seem like you really regret any of your actions, so I'm going to give you the maximum of 45 years. So by if a judge feels some sort of personal snub, they could really end up screwing you.
Well, after Mr. Cosby was found guilty in the second trial, he brought in a new team for sentencing.
Yeah.
And I wasn't there for the sentencing, but I certainly followed it. And if you look at the reporting on the sentencing, you'll see that the trial judge began with some type of statement that seemed totally rehearsed to me. Okay, Mr. Cosby, the time has come, something like that. I mean, I can envision this trial judge rehearsing that for weeks. I mean, this was not a fair trial, and he got an awful treatment by a justice system that's supposed to be a lot better than this. And I think that was the gist of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision. Our legal system was supposed to be better than what they saw in the Cosby prosecution. They saw politics. They saw disrespecting what a prior DA had done. They saw the introduction of evidence that was highly inflammatory and improper. They saw all kinds of manipulation for selfish reasons. Mm-hmm. And basically they said this was a bait and switch, which is, think about it. Think about looking at the legal system, the way this was conducted, and having the Supreme Court say this was just a bait and switch, like it was a hustle.
Right.
He was hustled.
Yeah.
That's basically what they said.
If you get offered immunity and you take that offer and say what you have to say, and then they come back and say, oh, never mind, that immunity doesn't count, then no one would take an immunity agreement.
Of course not. And the system would break down.
It'd break down the whole system, yeah.
Because you can't try every case. I mean, 90+% of cases nationwide are resolved before a trial.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have the courtrooms and the personnel to try every single case. So this is, plea bargaining, the kinds of agreements that result in a non-prosecution, they are very critical to the survival of the justice system. And in my opinion, the trial judge and the DA in Bill Cosby's case made a complete mockery of just very fundamental principles of due process and fundamental fairness in the system. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did something a lot of people don't see very often. They said, look, the principle of fundamental fairness under our Constitution was violated. We're going to vacate the conviction. We're going to throw this case out, and it can never be reprosecuted. There can be no retrial, is what they said.
Well, Bill Cosby was found guilty on 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault, right? And I guess before the actual sentencing, and this is something that Scott Ross talked about, I brought him in for an interview, which was your one of your private investigators.
Yes.
He said that one of the things that he thinks kind of swayed the judge a bit was that after Bill Cosby was found guilty, Cosby's wife made a statement bashing the judge. I'm
not going to comment on that.
Okay.
Mrs. Cosby, this is a free country. She had a right to express her opinion on the trial.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be critical of Mrs. Cosby for 1 second on that. She was furious at the way this thing was conducted. Mm-hmm. She was livid at the injustice. She was right. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in my opinion, has vindicated Mrs. Cosby and Mr. Cosby.
So then, ultimately, the judge sentenced Bill Cosby. And he was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison, plus fine $25,000 and the cost of prosecution, which was like $44,000. Not a lot of money for Bill. That's not the main.
I'm not going to comment.
Yeah. But ultimately, he got 3 to 10 years in prison. When you heard 3 to 10, what did you think?
I was furious. I mean, this man didn't belong in this courtroom being convicted and sentenced of anything. The progressive injustice that went on in this case from the beginning, non-prosecution agreement, telling his lawyers and Mr. Cosby to rely on that agreement. It's set in stone. Then the politics intrude. Then an opponent starts advertising, I'll go after Mr. Cosby if you elect me. And then one thing leads to another. And if you look at this from a distant perspective, it's an outrage, all of it. One outrageous thing leads to another outrageous thing, leads to another outrageous thing. And the politicization of the justice system becomes overwhelming. And, my team and I would talk all the time about just the manifest injustice in this courtroom and the record we need to make. And the way this judge was trying to spin everything, and the way the DA was trying to spin everything with unrelated accusations that can't be possibly investigated going back 30 years in other parts of the country. I mean, it was just a travesty of justice, a disgrace to the justice system, and it's been revealed for what it was, a bait and switch, something that should never, ever have gotten off the ground. And thank God it's been buried by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's exhaustive, detailed, compelling opinion.
So Bill Cosby gets sentenced. He gets sent to prison to start his prison sentence. On June 25th, 2019, Cosby actually filed an appeal, right? Kind of shows that this was roughly 2 years ago when they filed the appeal. In 2021, he was up for parole, but the parole was denied. And I guess one of the reasons why the parole was denied was because Bill Cosby refused to take a sexual offender class in prison.
And he refused to express remorse for something he never did.
Yeah.
He refused to take these courses because he said, I'm not guilty of this. I never did this. He's a man of conviction. He could have played the game if he wanted to get released on parole, to get out of there. And he refused to play any game. He said, I'm innocent. I never did this. I'm not going to say or do anything that suggests I'm guilty, because I'm not.
Right. I think OJ even spoke on and said that Bill should have taken those classes and get out early. And Bill, you're talking about someone who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had been living, the high life for most of his life, is 80-something years old, blind, and he's willing to sit all 10 years in prison to prove a point.
Absolutely. This is a man of stellar conviction, stellar character. You don't see people built like this too often.
So then June 30th, 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court found an agreement with the previous prosecutor, prevented Cosby from being charged in the case, and overruled the conviction. The Supreme Court's decision prevents him from being tried again on the same charges a third time.
That's correct.
When you heard that news, what'd you think?
I was ecstatic, absolutely ecstatic. I think most people who followed what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was saying and doing about this case thought it was more likely that the reversal would be based on the unrelated accusers being allowed to testify, the judge increasing the number from 1 to 5 to deny him a fair trial, which is exactly what the judge did. Most people thought they would focus on those grounds and less on the agreement. But what they did was they focused on the agreement. And they said, if this agreement is binding and enforceable, there's no reason to get to these other issues, because the case is going to be thrown out and can't be retried. And that's exactly what they did.
So explain to everyone what an appeal means. So from what I understand, when a judge rules a certain type of way and you appeal, a set of higher judges could actually review it and throw out that judge's decision.
That's correct. What an appeal is typically based on the transcript of the trial.
Mm-hmm.
You don't bring new evidence in an appellate proceeding. It's based on the plain wording of the transcripts. And another panel of judges gets the transcripts of the trial from day one till the end, and they and their staff and their researchers go through every page. They first look at briefs filed by both sides. The defense files a notice of appeal, notifying everybody that there's going to be an appeal. A schedule is set. The defense files an appellate brief. The prosecution files a response to that appellate brief. Typically, the defense files a reply to that response. And other documents are sometimes filed depending on what state you're in or what system you're talking about, federal or state. And eventually, there's oral argument after the appellate judges have a chance to read the briefs, read the transcripts, do their own research, their own inquiry into what went on and what didn't go on. And it's a process, a world unto itself. And eventually, the appellate body of judges will rule as to whether they accept, in whole or in part, the appeal.
How many judges voted on that in order to throw it out?
Well, there was first the appellate court. First, the appellate court in that particular jurisdiction in Pennsylvania denied the appeal.
Aha.
So a court of appeals denied it, and then it went to the judges of the Supreme Court, and they reviewed, as I said before, everybody's briefs. They reviewed the transcripts of the evidence. They basically looked at what had happened in the trial court, looked at what had happened in the appellate court below them, and they had an oral argument at one point, which was December 1st or 2nd of last year. And the judges who attended questioned lawyers for both sides. And, it was pretty obvious to me that they felt this had been an unfair trial. Let me backtrack and say something else. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court only takes 2 to 4% of the appeals that are presented to it. In other words, these are cases where there was something happened at the trial level. It went to an appellate court, and then it went to the Supreme Court. They only accept 2 to 4% of the appeals that are presented to them. So that means very, very few cases progress from the appellate court to the Supreme Court.
Right.
They progress from the trial court to the appellate court, but very few to the Supreme Court, 2 to 4%. And if they take a case, they're very concerned about something. And they looked at all the issues raised by the appellate lawyers for Mr. Cosby. They decided to accept 2 issues out of all the issues that were presented to them. The 2 issues they said concerned them, and the only 2 issues they said they would look at, were allowing 5 unrelated accusers to testify for the prosecution, in addition to the underlying accuser, and whether or not there was a binding agreement not to prosecute him that he and his lawyers relied on. The principle in law is called detrimental reliance. They were bothered by the fact that Castor had testified under oath that I entered into a binding agreement, and I told them they have to rely on that agreement and give a deposition. They were very bothered by both of those principles. The questioning at oral argument before the Supreme Court seemed to be more about the 5 unrelated accusers. And they did question rather strongly about whether or not there was a agreement not to prosecute, but it seemed like they spent more time and more energy on the allowance of 5 unrelated accusers. And so many people who watched it, like myself, said they think this was an unfair trial. They've made that clear. They're probably going to issue a ruling primarily on the 5 unrelated accusers. And various legal organizations were filing briefs with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court asking them to provide guidance in the future about when it's permissible for a trial judge to call unrelated accusers in a criminal case because it's such prejudicial evidence. I mean, the Public Defenders Association asked the court for guidance. So many legal organizations around the country were anticipating an opinion that primarily focused on the 5 unrelated accusers. And what we got was an opinion that almost exclusively focused on the agreement not to prosecute. And once they said there was an agreement not to prosecute that he and his lawyers relied on to their detriment, what happened after that was inevitable. They would have to say, you cannot retry him. We're enforcing this non-prosecution agreement. Now, if they had said, we think it was unjust to allow the prosecution to bring in 5 unrelated accusers, they could have said, you can try him again, but follow our principles of what's right and what's fair.
Yeah.
But the ruling basically was, this should never have happened. It was a bait and switch. Mr. Cosby's right to fundamental fairness under the Constitution was denied. None of this should have happened. There should have been not 1 trial, not 2 trials, not an appellate process. He should never have gone to prison. He should never have been sentenced. They said it's all a nullity. The case should never have been brought. His conviction is vacated. He's to be released from prison forthwith, and he's not to be retried. It was a very powerful, very stunning decision that people around the country are still reading because they basically said, we're not going to allow prosecutors to put a defendant through a hustle, a bait and switch, a con artist type hustle, where now you see an agreement not to prosecute, now you don't. This is not justice. This is not America. And they seem very strong about what they felt should have happened and what should not have happened. But again, I'm emphasizing, as I have before, this man went through a charge, an arrest, having to find an attorney and a defense team. He went through all the rigors of pretrial process in a criminal case. He went through a trial. It was a mistrial. He had to do it again. There had to be a second trial. He had to go through the motions, the court appearances, the argument among lawyers. Then a second jury had to be picked. He goes through a second trial. They come back guilty. He has to be sentenced. Then the appellate process starts. You go through appellate lawyers. They make their arguments in the trial court. They make their arguments in the appellate court. They make their arguments in the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, he's languishing in prison for almost 3 years. And all of a sudden, the highest court in the state of Pennsylvania says, none of this should have happened. Throw it all out. Free him immediately, and don't you dare retry him on this case. It's a stunning set of events, but he should never have been put through this ordeal, ever.
Justice David Norman Wecht, who was one of the Supreme Court judges in Pennsylvania, said, "We hold that when a prosecutor makes an unconditional promise of non-prosecution and when the defendant relies upon that guarantee to the detriment of his constitutional right not to testify, the principle of fundamental fairness that undergirds due process of law in our criminal justice system demands that the promise be enforced."
You know, there are terms that are used in constitutional law in America that have been used a lot and which the public relates to, things like due process, equal protection. Fundamental fairness is the equivalent of what we call due process, equal protection. Fundamental fairness means you have to look at a proceeding, and if it violates common sense, everyday notions of what's fair, it should not be sanctioned. And what they said was, how can you possibly let someone believe there's an agreement not to prosecute? How can you possibly let someone believe they have no Fifth Amendment rights anymore in a civil deposition, and then pull the rug out from under them after the defendant relies on the prosecution's agreement? And how can you possibly allow this mess to go forward? And they between the lines, you see, in my opinion, a total disgust with what was done to Bill Cosby. You have very, very learned, courageous judges at the highest level in the state who looked carefully at the trial transcripts, looked carefully at the briefs that were filed before them, and probably spent many months conferring among themselves, how did this happen? How do you have a DA testify under oath, I made a binding agreement, and they relied on it because I told them they have to rely on it? How does it then suddenly get politicized, thrown out the door, and this horror show of justice or injustice go forward? It's a very, very unique set of events. And let me say something else. This conviction was not reversed on a technicality. It was not reversed on a gimmick. It was not reversed on a arcane, little understood, little known procedural ploy. The first DA didn't just agree not to prosecute. He first investigated the case. He says, I used 2 police departments, Cheltenham and Montgomery County. I talked to my staff. I talked to our fellow prosecutors. I made a definite conclusion that this case should not be pursued in a criminal court. The agreement not to prosecute was based on that investigation and that substantive conclusion. It wasn't based on a procedural gimmick or a esoteric, arcane, technical something. The opponents of Bill Cosby, who don't like this, are trying to suggest that this was not a substantive look at whether he was guilty or innocent. This was not a substantive look about whether this case could go forward. It was a substantive look, and a decision was made the case should not go forward on the evidence we have, on what the law is and what the evidence is. That's what the agreement not to prosecute was based upon a substantive investigation and a substantive conclusion not to go further with this case. This is not some technical gimmick at all.
Well, right. Justice Wecht said that the court's decision to bar prosecution on those particular charges are both very severe and rare, but he said it was necessary because even though society has a strong interest in prosecuting crimes, has an even stronger interest in ensuring that the constitutional rights of the people are vindicated. Two other justices actually agreed with him, and they said in writing, which you've basically been saying the whole time, due process does not permit the government to engage in this type of coercive bait and switch.
That says it all.
Yeah.
It was a hustle. It was a political hustle that corrupted the legal process and resulted in years of injustice for Mr. Cosby.
Right. And they basically said that they could have permitted a retrial but not use evidence from the deposition.
Well, that's what one judge suggested could be a remedy, but the majority said, no, this agreement is going to be enforced. This case should never have been brought. There's going to be no retrial.
Now, from the outside looking in, when you hear people commenting, the one thing that a lot of people would say is, well, Cosby's worth hundreds of millions. He probably paid off some of the judges.
Let me tell you something. There's a misnomer in society that celebrities buy justice that other people can't buy. Well, the reality is the opposite. If Bill Cosby hadn't been Bill Cosby, none of this would have happened. I call it celebrity injustice. Okay, if you're a celebrity with a lot of perceived power and popularity and wealth, you are a target. And if you look statistically, what happens to most celebrities who are prosecuted, most are convicted. Not the opposite. You know, because O.J. Simpson was acquitted, because a few celebrities appear to have prevailed in the system, this misnomer of celebrity justice that can be bought appeared. It's exactly the opposite. You are a bigger target. They throw more resources at you when they come after you. I mean, in Michael Jackson's case, they had the FBI, they had Interpol, they had the local district attorney, they had the local police, they had the local sheriffs. They threw everything at him they could find to try and get him convicted. This is celebrity injustice, not justice. You're a bigger target of everybody's wrath or desire to get something for themselves. This case happened because it was Bill Cosby, a black male celebrity, a popular man with a lot of strong views on things he did and experienced and believed in. A man very popular, a man spent $200 million propping up black universities, helping people get educated, helping social causes he believed in. I mean, if it hadn't been Bill Cosby, I don't think this thing would have gone anyplace. And certainly the trial judge wouldn't have been making the rulings he made in a case of someone with no popularity and no publicity. So keep in mind, celebrities are typically subjected to attacks that they wouldn't be subjected to if they weren't celebrities. The state or the federal government will throw resources at them they don't throw at other people. And the majority of celebrities who are prosecuted in the criminal justice system are convicted either by way of a guilty plea, a plea bargain, or a conviction.
So does this mean, now that the charges were vacated, that Bill Cosby is not a registered sex offender?
He is not a registered sex offender. He is not a convicted felon. He hasn't been convicted of anything, and he can't be re-prosecuted. What the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said was this was a hustle, a bait and switch, and an absolute disgrace.
Well, Mr. Castor, the previous district attorney who made the deal with Bill Cosby, he was interviewed after the case, after the appeal went through. He said, I was right back in 2005, and I'm right in 2021. I'm proud of our Supreme Court for having the courage to make an unpopular decision.
That says a lot. And he was the district attorney of that county. He had the power to bind them, and he bound them. It was political opponents who tried to step in and unwind what he had done, and ultimately they failed. But they put Mr. Cosby and his family through a lot of suffering in the process.
Well, the prosecutors could actually appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court in Pennsylvania.
I'm not an appellate lawyer, And I certainly don't practice in Pennsylvania. My understanding is they can ask for reconsideration or something along those lines. From everything I've been told, it's likely to be very futile, particularly in a case like this. This opinion is about 77 pages. It was carefully thought through.
Now, there was a word going around that Bill Cosby might actually sue the state of Pennsylvania.
I don't know what his plans are in that regard at all. I haven't talked to him. I don't know.
Okay, but if you were his lawyer right now and he said, I want to sue the state of Pennsylvania, does he have a case?
I'd leave that up to his current legal team. I'm not going to interject.
Okay.
And I don't do civil work. I mean, once in a while, people ask me to get involved in a civil trial, but I generally don't litigate civil cases. So I would not be the one to consult on that.
Well, ultimately, this was a big blow to Me Too and the people who stand behind it. Ms. Constant, her lawyer, said the decision was not only disappointing, but also expressed concerns and may discourage those who seek justice for sexual assault in the criminal justice system from reporting or participating in the prosecution of the assailant, or may force the victim to choose between filing either a criminal or civil action. 8 of Bill Cosby's accusers say they're stunned and disgusted. They said the anger keeps growing and growing. One of them, Victoria Valentino, said, I'm angry at the legal system. We put our necks on the line, and then the legal system yanked the rug out from under us. We are re-victimized time and time again through the whole judicial process, and so forth and so forth. But ultimately, the way I look at it is this man went through the legal system. He did not pay anyone off. He did not escape from prison. He didn't dig a hole like El Chapo. He did his time. And ultimately, he was vindicated. So whoever has a problem with it will just have to have a problem with it.
We all have rights under the Constitution. They're sacred rights, and we're all entitled to be treated equally and properly in the criminal justice system, and he was not treated properly at any time.
There's word that he's going to be doing a comedy tour.
I don't know anything about his future plans.
Right. And also there's word that he's doing his own documentary, which I think is a fabulous idea. Because in today's world, and you even remember with your Michael Jackson case, a documentary was what triggered Michael Jackson's criminal investigation.
That was the Bashir documentary.
Right.
Yes.
And I think it's great if, and then you saw what happened in the R. Kelly case as well. Once Surviving R. Kelly came out, a couple weeks later, all these new charges pop up and suddenly R. Kelly's locked up. So I think it's great for some of these celebrities who have money to say, something, I'm going to make my own documentary and I'm going to bring in my own people to speak about it. I'm going to show how these various people are liars and are frauds and, have been scamming the system and so forth. Like, for example, when I brought in, investigator Scott Ross, when we talked about the Michael Jackson case, he showed, he found evidence that the mother of the accuser was doing welfare fraud. She had basically scammed JCPenney for a fake lawsuit saying that she was sexually assaulted by security guards, even though she was caught stealing in the JCPenney. So I think it's very important to show both sides of the story, but a lot of times when you have a documentary, especially when it's a big budget documentary like a Leaving Neverland or a Surviving R. Kelly, Russell Simmons had one made about him as well, people just come to the conclusion that this documentary must be facts because I'm seeing it on television.
I wish the Cosby family the best. I think they've been through an ordeal they never should have been subjected to. And whatever his plans are for the future, I wish him the very best.
Well, recently, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was part of Jeffrey Epstein's situation, she said that Bill Cosby's freedom justifies dropping sex trafficking charges against her. What's your take on that?
Well, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's opinion is going to have ramifications throughout the system because these judges issued about a 77-page opinion, carefully worded, carefully thought out, and anyone else in a criminal case anywhere in America, if they can use that opinion for their advantage, they're going to try to, and their lawyers would be remiss not to try to. It's a very, very unusual opinion, reflected a lot of concern for fairness in the system, and anyone who can use that opinion to their advantage will try to.
So people are going to reference this case to try to get their clients out
Yes.
and everything.
Yes.
Now, will it work? Who knows?
Every case is unique.
Well, Tom Mesereau, I appreciate you joining us once again. I think we've been relatively fair in terms of our coverage of the Bill Cosby case. We actually had a lot of our guests speak out for Bill Cosby. And in fact, our interviews were posted on Bill Cosby's Instagram page. Like, Faison Love or Sinbad, some of the guests that actually spoke on, for Bill Cosby's innocence. Bill Cosby used that to try to, get people on his side and kind of show the other side of the story. And ultimately, these people seem to have been right. You worked on him on his retrial. He ultimately let you go. But the work that you put in ultimately helped him get free at the very end.
I had a great trial team, and we made a great appellate record. This is the best appellate record I've ever seen made in a criminal trial. I had 4 seasoned appellate lawyers objecting, moving for mistrials on a constant basis, filing legal points and authorities. It was, when I realized how unfair this judge was going to be right off the bat, I said, we have to, at the very least, make sure the record's perfect for appeal. I had one lawyer who made 13 motions for a mistrial. I had 3 other lawyers making constant objections, filing those objections in the record, filing legal authorities to support the objections. I'm glad we did the job we did because I think it was a perfect record for appeal.
I mean, when this happens, when a judge goes and makes certain decisions like this, and then the Supreme Court above him basically throws out the whole trial, does that make the judge look bad or threaten his job at all?
Well, you'd have to ask him, but in my opinion, he doesn't look too good,
Okay.
to say the least.
But judges, when they get that job, they get it for life.
This is an elected position,
Oh.
is my understanding.
Aha.
Again, I'm not a Pennsylvania resident and I don't practice law there, but my understanding is it's an elected position.
So he could not get elected next time around.
If my information is correct, you're right.
Okay. And how long do they get elected for?
I don't know the exact answer to that.
Let's look it up real quick. Here we go. So for the Supreme Court, Superior Court, Commonwealth Court, and Court of Common Pleas, there's a 10-year term. For the magistral district courts and municipal courts, judges serve a 6-year term. So in this case, which one is that?
I'm not sure what term would apply to him. I just don't know.
Okay, so
I don't
6 to
wanna
10
act
years.
like I know and I don't.
Okay, so 6 to 10 years. So ultimately, he has to reapply and try to get elected.
In my opinion, this will not help his reputation at all.
I don't think so. Well, Bill Cosby is free. I guess you haven't had a chance to actually talk to him yet,
I
right?
have not, no.
Okay, well, maybe at some point.
Sure.
You guys will talk. I've been in contact with some of his people throughout the trial. They're very happy. Bill did not die in prison, which, at his age, that's a very real risk.
Well, you had COVID. You
Yeah.
had the pandemic. I mean,
It was a
you
mess.
should never have been subjected to this, ever.
And now he's free. He's welcome to do whatever he wants, however he wants it. I know he called into a radio station to state his innocence. And some people are going to agree with it. Some people are not. But this is, once again, a monumental case, which you presided, that you worked with, along with the Michael Jackson case and so forth. So, it was definitely an honor, to speak to you about it, coming, straight from the horse's mouth.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor for me to be here, and I really enjoy being interviewed on your show, and wish you all the best.
Absolutely. Until next time. Peace.